Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 104 called The Siege of Constantinople. First, let me say Happy New Year. I hope you had a good break if you took one over the holiday season. In 2025, we'll have many more episodes of this podcast as we follow the Roman Empire's path to its final fall, which, in my view, occurred when Islam rose to eclipse it as the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. After that, the Roman Empire became a Greek medieval state we call Byzantium. Yes, it continued some of the culture and institutions of the late Romans, but in my view, it was also sufficiently different to be best described as a successor state to the Roman Empire rather than a continuation of it. But this last part of the story of the decline and fall of Rome is, I think, the most fascinating of all, as we trace the extraordinary reign of the Emperor Heraclius, his victory over Persia and then his defeat at the hands of a nascent Islam. And of course, these times were critically important to the formation of the modern world. So, without further ado, let's get into it. In the last episode, we left Heraclius in an almost impossible situation. An enormous Avar army was advancing on Constantinople, while in Asia Minor, despite his victories over 3 Persian armies, he was still outnumbered and faced another major Persian offensive. Most people would have given up, but not Heraclius. His priority in 626 was the defence of Constantinople. He knew it would be catastrophic if it fell, not least because it would leave him stranded in Asia Minor, and even if he could extract himself from there, the only part of the empire that would be left and the only place he could go would be his homeland of Carthage in North Africa. So, how best to defend the city? Probably most people would have recommended putting all of the Roman resources into its defence, which would have meant retreating from eastern Anatolia, which is eastern modern-day Turkey, back to the city. But Heraclius never did the obvious. He didn't retreat to Constantinople to defend it. Instead, he stayed about 1,000 miles to the east. His aim was to inflict another defeat on the Persians in Anatolia. He was still facing a powerful Persian army there, led by Shahrbaraz, comprising the remnants of the 3 armies he'd defeated the previous year. The other main Persian general, Shah, was also recruiting and building a new army back in Iran. Heraclius knew he'd be overwhelmed if the 2 armies joined against him. So, before it arrived, he wanted to defeat Shahrbaraz by luring him into an ambush in the Taurus Mountains. These were the same tactics he'd used the previous year in Armenia, when he'd employed his army's superior mobility to outmaneuver the pursuing Persians. In March 626, he crossed into the Taurus mountain range, knowing Shahrbaraz would pursue him. The Romans' competitive advantage was speed. I think his infantry must have had their own horses. These wouldn't have been the excellently trained war horses which his horsemen used, but pack animals to carry the infantry faster than if they'd been on foot. The Persians also had excellent horsemen, but in contrast, they were slowed down by their infantry. For once, however, Heraclius's tactics failed. Shahrbaraz was getting wise to his tricks. Our sources don't provide us with much detail. They tell us of skirmishes, but no major engagements, and certainly not a Roman victory. Instead, our main source on this part of the war, the chronicler Theophanes, focuses on Heraclius's personal heroics. For example, he says the Persians had cornered the Romans by a bridge until in desperation Heraclius himself led a charge across it. Theophanes vividly describes the emperor leading his troops, killing Persians right, left and centre. In particular, quote, a giant of a man met and attacked him, i.e. Heraclius, in the middle of the bridge. The emperor struck him and hurled him into the river. When he fell, the barbarians turned in flight and threw themselves into the river like frogs." End quote. This certainly isn't the only description of Heraclius engaged in personal combat against the enemy, but I suspect on this occasion there's a bit of exaggeration. Nevertheless, although he didn't defeat Sharbaraz, at least he stopped him from advancing on Constantinople. Meanwhile, back in the city, things were looking bleak indeed. The Avar Khagan had spent the last year preparing for the most powerful assault on the city in its entire history. He'd gathered a much larger army than the one he used in his abortive attack on Thessalonica 4 years earlier. In addition to the Avars, he'd assembled a formidable army of Slavs, causing George of Pisidia, who was present at the siege, to say the combined force amounted to 80,000 men, an incredibly large army for this period in history. The Avars also had a collection of siege engines, and most disconcertingly for the Romans, a huge number of Slav boats. These seem to have been canoes made out of hollowed-out trees, and although we have no specific mention of it, there's no doubt the Avars and Persians were in touch with each other and planning a concerted attack on the capital. But, as ever, Heraclius had been far from idle in preparing the city's defences. He'd entrusted the city to two of his most able lieutenants, a general called Bonus and the patriarch Sergius. Sergius fully realised the severity of the crisis. He'd already released the church's gold to fund a new army, and now he busied himself with bolstering morale in the city by praying fervently for divine deliverance. But the Romans needed more than divine help. The genuine star of the city's defence was the general Bonus, about whom we know almost nothing except he was one of Heraclius's favourite commanders and had proved himself fighting the Persians in the previous year. As we'll hear, it was he who would come up with the tactical genius that would be so important in the next few days. Also present in the city was the emperor's 14-year-old son, Heraclius Constantine, although his presence was purely symbolic, since he was far too young to have a hand in the city's defence. We're fortunate to have an outstanding record of this siege left to us by our trusty poet, George of Pisidia. He describes the preparations for the city's defence that began more than a year before the Avars appeared. The first and most important of these was maritime. A large fleet of small manoeuvrable warships, probably best described as cutters, was built to protect the city's sea walls, which were smaller and more vulnerable to attack than the giant Theodosian land walls. This could have been Heraclius's own idea, since he'd found it surprisingly easy to take Constantinople by sea back in 610, when he'd landed his African army in several of the city's harbours and deposed the usurper Phocas. The second priority was a good supply of food and soldiers to man the walls. With the former, Egypt had ceased supplying the capital since 619, when it fell to the Persians, so it was up to Thrace and Bithynia, the hinterland of the city, to supply it. Heraclius might also have arranged special shipments from North Africa, something he'd have been well placed to do. But there was enough concern for the authorities to increase the price of a loaf of bread from 3 to 8 follis, the follis being the Roman copper coin. An enormous increase, although it was quickly abandoned when it led to protests outside Hagia Sophia, which even the palace guard, the Scolae, joined. But the Romans didn't move civilians out of the city, such as would occur nearly a century later with the Arab siege in 717 to 18, suggesting there was enough grain stockpiled for a lengthy siege. Of course, The core of the city's defences was the triple set of Theodosian land walls, probably the best defensive structure in the entire world at the time. But they still required soldiers to man them. This is where we need to rejoin Heraclius in the faraway Taurus mountains, since, after battling with Shabaraz's army, he crossed these mountains through the so-called Cilician Gates, the long passageway flanked by vertiginous cliffs on either side, that formed the entrance to the Mediterranean section of Anatolia. And there he set up headquarters at Caesarea, the capital of Cappadocia, where he dispatched a force of some 3,000 elite horsemen to reinforce Constantinople. They quickly reached the city and strengthened its garrison, which George of Pisidia says amounted to some 12,000 soldiers in total. With 3,000 of them Heraclius's troops, the remaining 9,000 probably comprised around a couple of thousand imperial guards, in addition to the normal garrison. The arrival of Heraclius's horsemen also boosted the city's morale, since they recounted the stories of his heroics against the Persians. In advance of the Avar host, refugees fled the Thracian countryside, probably mainly heading for Constantinople itself, although there must have been an attempt to prevent them entering the city in order to preserve its food supplies. Providing evidence of this flight, 2 large hoards of coins dating back to this time have been uncovered, with their wealthy owners, for whatever reason, unable to retrieve them. A Roman embassy was dispatched to meet the Khagan, led by the highly respected and brave senator Anathasius, to offer peace terms, including a promise of tribute if they desisted. The Khagan didn't chop off their heads, but neither did he agree to peace. On the 29th of July, 626, he arrived before the city walls and drew up his army in full battle order to impress the Romans. It must have been a truly terrifying sight, 80,000 warriors baying for Roman blood. But the Romans weren't intimidated. Bonus rallied the troops who manned the walls, brandishing spears and artillery, ready for the Avar onslaught, while Sergius led a procession through the city and up onto the walls, carrying an icon of Christ. The siege lasted precisely 10 days, considerably longer than the 33-day siege of Thessalonica. The next day, the 30th of July, was another day of posturing by the Avars. They moved armoured shelters up to within bowshot of the walls, where their men could taunt the Romans without being shot. Meanwhile, Bonus tried to keep diplomatic channels open by sending the Khagan sumptuous food and an offer of tribute if he withdrew. On the 31st of July, the fighting began. The Avars attacked along the entire length of the land walls, concentrating on the central section where the walls dipped down into the Lycus Valley and offered a weaker defensive position. The Avars used their Slav units as cannon fodder, sending them into battle first, followed by the more heavily armoured Avar warriors. This meant the Slav casualties were extremely high, something they would not later forget or forgive. George of Pisidia's poetry provides us with vivid images of the ferocious battle. A slinger bringing down an Avar warrior with one shot of his stone, an arrow from an unseen archer striking down an Avar leader in mid-speech, and a huge stone projectile sent hurtling through the air by one of the Roman wall artillery machines, smashing through a line of Avar shields and crushing the men concealed beneath them. On that first day, the Romans had little difficulty repelling their attackers, and even sallied out from the southern section of the wall at Pegae to inflict casualties on the retreating enemy. On the next day, the 1st of August, the Slav-Avar attacks continued against the walls, helped by a growing number of siege engines and artillery pieces. The latter mainly comprised manganika catapults, which hurled heavy stones, and petrarii, giant crossbows which fired massive arrows. The Avar artillery concentrated on the central section of the wall in the Lycus Valley, hoping to break through there. 12 siege towers were dragged towards it, some almost as tall as the walls themselves, and protected by coverings of animal hides. One of the many sailors in the city came up with the ingenious idea of hanging a small boat held by a mast from the walls in front of one of the siege towers. When the boat was set alight, its flames engulfed the siege tower, which turned into a towering inferno. Bonus was delighted with this ingenuity and lavishly rewarded the sailor. So far, I haven't mentioned the Persians who were encamped nearby on the other side of the Bosphorus at Chalcedon. This was a small detachment of Shahrbaraz's army, which had bypassed Heraclius's troops camped at Caesarea. But without a fleet, the Persians couldn't cross the Bosphorus and help the Avars. Like the Persian general Shahan's appearance at Chalcedon 11 years earlier, in 615, in fact, they posed no threat whatsoever to the Romans in the city. When it came to it, the much vaunted alliance between the Avars and Persians counted for nothing. Nevertheless, the two sides still tried to communicate across the Bosphorus, although this was made difficult by the Roman command of the sea, with their cutters plying up and down the straits night and day. Nevertheless, on the 5th day of the siege, the 2nd of August, 3 Persian envoys evaded the Roman patrols and made it to the Avar camp. The Khagan wanted to show off his alliance with the Persians to intimidate the city's defenders, and hurriedly invited a Roman delegation to discuss peace terms. Sergius and Bonus responded by sending a delegation of 5 Roman senators, including one of our minor chroniclers, to the Avar camp. This chronicler, Theodore Syncellus, has left us with an amusing description of the meeting, in which he described the Khagan, whose name has never been recorded, as physically repulsive and utterly barbaric. He describes how the brave Romans took delight in making sarcastic comments about his physical appearance, flattering him with false praise, in particular saying how a Khagan as handsome and powerful as him shouldn't need the help of the Persians. Meanwhile, the 3 Persian envoys are described as being dressed in silk finery as if for a party. They enjoyed mocking the Romans, who were told by the Khagan to return to the city and prepare for its surrender if they wanted to remain alive. But the last laugh lay very much with the Romans, for the 3 Persian envoys were intercepted by Roman warships as they made their way back across the Bosphorus. A grisly fate awaited them. The first was beheaded. The Romans then cut off the hands of the second and sent him, although he must have been barely alive, back to the Avars with the head of the first envoy tied around his neck. The 3rd Persian was then taken in a warship to the coast in front of the Persian camp at Chalcedon, where he was beheaded on board ship and his head catapulted into the Persian camp, with a message attached to it saying, quote, "The Khagan, after making terms with us, sent us your ambassadors, so we've chopped the heads of 2 of them off, and look, here's the 3rd. Spreading disinformation like the idea the Khagan had made peace with the Romans was standard Roman practice. The execution of the Persian envoys infuriated the Khagan. He sent wave after wave of Slavs against the city walls, only for their bodies to pile up in the moat. Finally, on the 10th and last day of the siege, the 7th of August, he unleashed what he thought would be his masterstroke. This was a joint attack on the city by a fleet of Slav canoes, which had been dragged to the head of the Golden Horn, together with the usual onslaught of Slavs and Avars on the land walls. The Kagan thought the Slavonic canoe attack would be a surprise for the Romans, but Bonus had been expecting it for days and had devised a strategy to lure the Slavs to a watery grave. He divided the Roman fleet of some 70 warships into two groups, one on either side of the Bosphorus. When the Slavs began sailing their canoes down the Golden Horn, one fleet engaged with them but retreated as if it feared this new maritime enemy. Yet this was merely a feigned retreat to lure the Slavs down into the mouth of the Golden Horn, where they were attacked in the rear by the second Roman fleet, which had lain in wait for them to pass. Surrounded on all sides by the Roman warships, the Slav fleet was annihilated, with thousands of Slavs killed. The blue water of the Golden Horn was said to have turned bright red with Slav blood. Meanwhile, the Kagan's fury mounted as he watched both the destruction of the Slav fleet and yet another massacre of his own forces in front of the city walls. In his fury, he ordered the execution of the Slav survivors who swam ashore from the wreck of their fleet. This was the last straw for the Slavs, used as cannon fodder in front of the land walls, and then seeing the survivors of the misjudged naval attack killed as if they'd been cowards, they rebelled and streamed out of the Avar camp back to the west. The Kagan had no option but to concede defeat. As his army retreated, he ordered the destruction of all of his siege machines. The smoke filled the sky and blotted out the sun for the whole of the next day. The Kagan's dreams had literally gone up in smoke. We don't know what happened to him, but I doubt he survived long after such a spectacular disaster. Back in the city, its inhabitants celebrated. It was an incredible victory. Tens of thousands of Slavs and Avars lay dead on the battlefield. Roman casualties were small. The church was quick to claim the credit. Sermons were read out telling of miracle stories. The Virgin Mary was said to have been seen on the walls during the fighting. A new cult of the Virgin Mary was born, venerating her as the protector of the city and worshipping a miraculously well-preserved piece of her woolen robe that was held in the huge basilica church of Blackenai, built by Justin I. But the real credit must, I think, go to Bonus and the Patriarch Sergius and Heraclius himself. Between the three of them, they'd organised a brilliant defence of the city. Heraclius should be credited with the construction of the fleet that gave the Romans complete control of the sea, as well as sending 3,000 of his best troops to defend the city. Bonus was an excellent tactician, ensuring the city was well supplied, its walls well manned, and brilliantly anticipating and destroying the Slav canoe attack. He was a step ahead of the Avar Kagan all the way. Finally, Sergius kept the city's inhabitants fueled with religious fervour and conviction their God would save them. But the year 626 was far from over. Two further events happened that year, both almost as significant as the Siege of Constantinople itself, although unfortunately we have precious little detail about them. First, at about the same time, the Kagan admitted defeat, i.e. on the 8th of August 626, Heraclius scored a spectacular victory over the new Persian army put together by the general Shan. The chronicler Theophanes hailed it as a great victory in which, quote, the Romans routed the Persians, killing a large number of them, end quote. This and another source mention a divinely induced hailstorm as the cause of Roman victory, which has left historians guessing at what really happened. The most likely answer is that the new Persian army contained raw recruits ill-matched to meet Heraclius's battle-hardened veterans. Although the Persians almost certainly outnumbered Heraclius's army, I suspect he outmaneuvered them in the mountains of Cappadocia, as he'd been hoping to do with Shabaraz's more experienced soldiers a few months earlier. Perhaps there was indeed a hailstorm which he took advantage of. We'll never know the truth, but what we do know is that this new Persian army disappeared from history, as did its commander, Shan. Theophanes said he died in disgrace. We also know it's from this moment onwards that the Persian army lost the initiative in Asia Minor. Shabaraz's army, some of which had occupied Chalcedon during the Avar siege, withdrew east. Heraclius had won the battle for Anatolia. It was yet another Roman triumph. And the second development was just as important. Again, our sources are vague, but there's no doubt the Turks finally launched their long-awaited attack through the Caucasus, pushing past the heavily fortified Caspian Gates and into northern Iran. They devastated the region before heading back north and sent a message to Khosroes saying they'd come to rescue the Roman Empire and to dethrone him. We'll look at the Turkish objectives and what their true motivation was more closely in the next episode. But suffice to say, by the end of 626, the world had been transformed. The Avar onslaught had been crushed, the Persians routed, and now the Turks had opened a second front against Persia. Heraclius's fortunes had gone full circle. Could he now achieve what had seemed impossible? Could he defeat Persia and win one of the greatest triumphs in Rome's entire history? And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in a week's time on the 18th of January. And if you're looking for something to read, I strongly recommend my new book on Justinian's turbulent reign called Justinian's Empire, link in the show notes. And a shout out to German listeners that the first book in my series called The Roman Revolution is now published in German, Die Römische Revolution, and you can find it on Amazon.de. Again, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.